All right, we're back again reacting to another video by Pally, and he talks about tunneling this time. Previous video I reacted to from Pally is gonna be in the description. That being said, let's get into it.
Hello everyone, my name is Pally, and I'm an OG 2016 DVD nerd who names Trapper and Bill. How you doing, Larry? Mwah. Anyway,
we love
today
Pally.
I'm going to be talking about the controversial truth about tunneling in Dead by Daylight. So let's jump right into it, shall we?
Let's go.
So first what I want to do is I want to define tunneling.
Ooh,
a lot of people have their own definition of tunneling, and most times those definitions are not only wrong, but they often end up being a form of coping from the person saying it. It's like the old dark side Phil ideology of blame everything on everyone else and never look what you could have done differently. I'm not saying that's everyone, but it's a large amount of people. People will label absolutely anything as tunneling these days. They could get unhooked, healed, sit a gen for 30 seconds, and still say they were tunneled. I've literally seen this happen. And throughout the last 9 years of playing Dead by Daylight, since the beta, I've seen it all. So for me, I can break tunneling down into 4 separate definitions based on different situations.
I have to say that I do agree. Tunneling in itself is a term that gets thrown around like crazy. Like, it gets thrown around like crazy. It's insane. And not every single case is tunneling. But because it's such such a buzzword, everybody goes into an uproar because they hear the term, you know? So this is understandable. I completely agree with this. Just to add on to it, it is simply a strategy in most cases, like especially if, you know, judging by the pace of the game, you know, it also could depend on the character you choose, which may require you to use more strategies compared to others, or different kinds of strategies compared to others. So it's ultimately just trying to win the game, the same way that survivors will, you know, also participate in ways to try to win the game, like body blocking, or, you know, comp cornering when they get to go down, pre-dropping, or, you know, other things that may not be, like, you know, the most interesting thing to go up against, like using a syringe or a septic, which is its own discussion. It's still a part of trying to win the game.
So starting with number 1, let's talk about accidental tunneling. And when it comes to accidental tunneling, the most common occurrence of this that I find is usually in the scenario where you're chasing someone else, and out of the blue you run into this person who just got off the hook as their teammate is maybe healing them or something, where you happen to be chasing. It could be near the hook they were on, or it could be anywhere else, but the fact is they were there, they're injured, why ignore the opportunity? You weren't specifically looking for them, you just happen to come across them. And you know what? That's fine. It's smart to go after that person. It happens, and that's okay. But that's what I would consider accidental tunneling. Moving on to number 2,
I will say that me personally, I don't necessarily participate in accidental tunneling at all, mainly because, like I've said, it is a strategy that you can utilize. So in some cases, when you are trying to plan ahead and, you know, try to win your match, you do have to sort of formulate in your mind the plan. And if the plan insists on, okay, well, this person, you know, we're at like 3 gens or 2 gens, there's 4 people still alive, I'm gonna have to go after this guy, like, again, you know, it's just another tool for me personally. Not really. I would say I never had it in a situation where I accidentally told anyone.
Desperation tunneling. And what is desperation tunneling? Well, it is exactly what it sounds like. It's tunneling out of desperation. Picture this. You're playing a relatively low tier M1 killer like Trapper or Pig on, say, Badham Preschool. You're down to 1 gen left with 2 over 50% in repair progress, and you don't even have anyone dead on hook yet. We've all been there, and no matter how skilled you are, it could happen to anyone. You find someone and you hook them for their second hook, and as soon as they get unhooked, you go after them again to get the kill. You do this because you desperately need someone dead, or you just lose. And if you don't do this, you have absolutely no chance of even getting a 2K unless the survivor's hard throw. It's high risk, high reward, because if they don't have any anti-tunnel perks, well, you just turn the game into a 3v1.
This is more so what I'm referring to when it comes to tunneling in a match. Like, you know, desperation tunneling is probably, I would say, really pretty much fits the bill with, you know, when you're playing a character like Ghostface, Trapper, Pig, you know, stuff like that. It is one of those things that just kind of happens. You end up having to desperation tunnel, pretty much is what he calls it. to try to at least confirm one person just to get something. This is pretty accurate. Yeah, I would say that this version of it is more common, especially because my mains are mainly M1s.
And that means even if they get that last gen done, you have a chance of a 2k or even a win. And I think most times this kind of tunneling is usually accepted by the community. Now, granted, that doesn't mean it's always accepted, but I would say usually it's accepted. Moving on to number 3, we have survivor-induced tunneling, or teammate-induced tunneling. And what is teammate-induced tunneling? Well, I'll give you a quick example. You hook someone, you walk away from the hook, you find a couple of gens with progress, you kick them, but you don't find any survivors. They've decided to hide and immerse. Well, time is always against the killer, so if the killer doesn't find anyone, they'll usually go back to the hook as soon as they hear the unhook notification. The issue is, once they get there, the only survivor you find, purely because of grunts of pain and a blood trail, is the person who was just unhooked, because the other person who unhooked them decided to go back to hiding and immersing. So the killer has no choice but to either waste time or just hook the survivor they can see. And so because no one wanted to take aggro, their teammate got tunneled. And I think this is one of those situations where survivors don't really see this perspective of the killer, and they just think the worst possible thing about the killer as a person.
I will say that I've seen survivor-induced tunneling very often, I would say. Now, there's obviously times I just choose not to follow through with that because of the fact that I am usually playing a lower tier character. So having to start a brand new fresh chase with 2 entire hits, and then also dealing with that side of the map with all those pallets, yada yada yada, very specific situations, you're just better off, you know, just basing it off of the flow of the match. You know, I would say survivor-induced. I would say it's fairly common. You probably have. I'm pretty sure everyone's had a match where like the survivors are actively just unhooking like directly in front of you, and you. I think because they're so used to the more polite way to 12 hook everybody, so when people kind of go against the grain and actually just go after that person because, you know, they made a mistake, and you're sort of countering and, you know, punishing that mistake by going after that same person again. Which is just, you know, kind of how it works with gaming in general. Like any game, a fighting game, you whiff an attack, you're getting comboed. You know, let's say you're playing a shooter and you blind your teammate somehow by misthrowing a flashbang, they get killed. That means that you lose a point or you lose your teammate. They get eliminated out of the round, and now you lose the round. You know what I mean? Like these are things that kind of happen. But you know, because it's such a divide with, oh, it's a party game versus it's a competitive game, even though it's literally in its design to be competitive because it's a team versus a team sort of thing. It's more common than you think.
Moving on to definition number 4, and this is the one most people have a problem with: hard tunneling. And hard tunneling is exactly what it sounds like. It's the tactic of repeatedly going out of your way to go after one survivor and only one survivor, ignoring all other survivors, ignoring generators until that survivor is dead, until they are out of the game. The flip side to this is that most times, unless the survivors are just hilariously bad or overly altruistic, this also means the killer is probably throwing the game. Of course,
this version of tunneling is what I'm sure people are referring to, and to be fair as well, like if there is a killer that is only going after that one survivor, they are going to lose the game. That is just going to happen, because while they're only focusing on that one person, they are going to waste a ton of time, meaning that the rest of the team can push out multiple gens at the same time. With the overabundance of gen speed perks, toolboxes as an option, and and just combining, you know, your efforts onto single gens and things of that nature, this would be no problem. However, it seems like it's more difficult to go up against because the person that's being chased most likely is not very skilled at looping. So if the killer is going to go after that person for as long as he's going to go after that person, and that survivor is skilled, you're pretty much guaranteeing a win, because if they're going to keep going after that person the entire game, they're essentially throwing. So I have to agree. It wouldn't be smart to go after that person, and that's why I say that something like this strategy is ultimately a tool, because as mentioned here, it can be sort of used in a way that is not going to allow you to win, right? You're just going to ruin, like, I wouldn't say ruining the experience, but because some people, even like myself, when I did play Survivor, or like many moons ago, the few times that I have played, I preferred to be chased because it was just more interesting. So the fact of the matter is, I feel like maybe people either not skilled enough, or maybe they're just not comfortable with being chased and they just like to touch the gens. And so, to me, at least from my perspective, like, being tunneled is almost a good thing, because you're like actually able to be in chase. Obviously, depending on context, like if your teammates wasted all the pallets and then you just kind of end up in a dead zone, then, you know, hey, it doesn't feel good. But, you know, if you got a solid team that at least knows what they're kind of doing, and, you know, you at least are confident in your ability to loop, then it should be a no-brainer. Like, hey, cool, finally, I'm being chased. You know what I mean? So it's one of those things. But yeah, hard tunneling is usually a bad idea. I would say in most cases, pretty much like every single case, to only go after that one person the entire game and lose the game for it, that's just a complete waste of time. And it makes no sense.
Of course, there are exceptions, and if the killer happens to get this one survivor out extremely early, sometimes before even a single gen has been done, more times than not the game is already over before it even began. This might be the only definition of tunneling where I would personally sympathize with the complaints of the survivor who was tunneled most of the time. So now that we know the definitions, this brings me to the question of how often tunneling actually happens. And to be honest, it's a really tricky question to answer, because while I do have my own data, at the end of the day, it's all anecdotal because I can't speak to everyone else's experience. However, other content creators, including Scott Jund, have done similar experiments over the years and have come up with very similar results. My experiment is the reason it's taken me a bit longer between videos this time, and I'll also provide a link to the Google Doc in the description below with time ranges, days, maps, specific killers, if you're curious to see the actual data. You'll also clearly see in this document the days that I had off, or the days I didn't stream when you look at it, and in case you're wondering, no, I barely ever escaped. My escape rate for this entire experiment was very, very low. So my data is based on an experiment that I conducted over a 2-week period, and the only reason it took me 2 weeks is because I don't have time to do this every day, and I just used the time that I had, and I wanted to get a specific amount of games in to include within my data. I did my experiment completely solo queue in Anon mode, so no one can look at my profile or have any real reason to tunnel me. Just a normal Bill player with an ugly sweater and no anti-tunnel perks.
Okay.
And during this 2-week period, I played 150 solo queue games at different times in the Eastern time zone, ranging from early afternoon to evening to late at night, or as some people call it, the demon hours. It's also worth mentioning that I did this entire experiment in 1v4 while 2v8 was a thing, which many people say makes 1v4 infinitely more sweaty than normal. Out of all 150 of these games that I played, either myself or a teammate was hard tunneled in 13 games. Now, if you're wondering what that means, that's literally 8.6%, give or take a decimal point or two, of the time during this experiment. And every single time, the person to be tunneled was the first person to be hooked, and it was very obvious that the killer had just spawned in with the purpose of tunneling out the first person they caught. But again, less than 10% of the time. I was also tunneled as a result of my teammates' actions in 11 games, which is 7.3%, again, give or take a decimal point or two, of the total 150 games I played. And it was almost always because they either refused to take chase anywhere except a broken main building, or just refused to take aggro, and the killer was simply making the smart play. This did not happen to my teammates because, well, to be honest, I will always take aggro. I love to be chased. It's my favorite part of playing Survivor because holding M1 is just boring. Another thing you might notice with the data is there is a direct correlation to tunneling when survivors bring a map offering they know full well is egregiously unfun for the killer to play on. Now again, I'm not going to say my experiment and the data that came from it are a definitive answer to how often tunneling happens, but given that other creators have done similar experiments, it's a pretty consistent indicator that tunneling isn't as rampant as people say it is. It seems to be the few bad experiences that just seem to stick and mentally outweigh the positive experiences that we have. One thing I can confidently say is, for some people on DBD Twitter who claim they get tunneled in every single game, if you truly are getting tunneled in every single game, I personally find it very hard to believe that it's out of nowhere. It just doesn't seem plausible. And believe it or not, while doing an experiment on tunneling, the biggest issue wasn't actually killers tunneling. The biggest issue And stop me if you've heard this, was my teammates giving up on Hook.
Interesting. So he's conducted an experiment. He's found that it only in all the games that he's collected, all the data, 8% of the time. That's very low. That's very low. Interesting. Very interesting. And he's saying that the real issue that he's actually had was people actually giving up. It kind of flips the tables around, you know? It basically means that the issue wasn't even the killer player, but the other survivor players are causing a bigger issue instead, which says a lot. That says a lot. Now, like I've said before, and I've always said this, like, the tunneling is a tool, and it is counterable quite easily, honestly. If you're skilled at chase, you're probably going to be able to buy your teammates a lot of time. Now, it does require your teammates to actually, you know, also know what they're doing to some degree. But that is sort of the nature of solo queue in general. Like, when there isn't any communication and you have to do a lot of guessing, it sort of comes with the territory. But overall, I have to say it's very interesting to see that the main it's not only is tunneling not that common, but on top of that, the main issue that he encountered was his teammates quitting, giving up, like fumbling the bag.
Usually on their very first hook. Well, as a killer, it's no secret that there is just more pressure on you throughout most of the game than there is on the survivors. And this isn't something I'm going to argue about because it's objectively true. There are 4 survivors and potentially 16 survivor perks with 5 generators to repair, and only 1 killer with 4 perks and up to 12 hook states to achieve. Every second you spend chasing one survivor is 3 seconds of gen time, and oftentimes that spreads across 3 separate generators. The entire flow of gameplay puts a heavier amount of pressure on the killer. So why do I bring this up? Because this is just one example of something that survivors aren't really thinking about when they're berating and insulting the killer in endgame chat over even the most innocent tunneling. Another thing that goes along with the killer's perspective is the lack of self-awareness that a lot of survivor-only players have when it comes to tunneling or even things like slugging and camping. For example, how often have you had a survivor commit to a 95% generator in your face after you hit them and you're in the weapon wipe animation? It happens to everyone, and you know what? There's no fundamental difference between a survivor committing to a gen in the killer's face and a killer tunneling a survivor out of the game. Some may even consider it worse because survivors have 5 gens to do while the killer has 12 hook states to get.
Thank you. So, shout out to Pally once again for keeping it 100% real. That is actual facts. The survivor side is definitely the easier side of the two. I mean, just objectively, right? You have teammates, you know, the objective is very simple, you know, you just do the gen. If you're chased, just survive, you know, learn how to loop, obviously. That's the main thing that you would need to learn when it comes to playing survivor is actually, you know, using the tiles and trying to buy your team as much time as humanly possible so that they have enough time to do the objective. And there's a lot more pressure because you are the main person having to do all of the work, right? Like, you are on the killer side, you're one killer, and you have to do everything yourself, you know what I'm saying? So, you know, you can't really blame a teammate or shift blame or do anything like that, really. You just, like, if you make a mistake, it's on you. So it's a lot more difficult as a result. And he makes a very valid point. There is a lack of self-awareness when it comes to the other side because they automatically will, you know, like, they'll take on the victim mentality and think that for some reason, what did I do to get this killer to start tunneling? And it's like, it's not even remotely personal at all, you know, ultimately. Because, like, keep in mind, like, a lot of the time, like, nobody knows who you are, bro. Like, we just see Laura, we just see Kate or Sable or something. It's not like we're looking at you personally and going, we need you out of this lobby for some specific reason. Ultimately, it's like, hey, I need somebody out of the game, and I have no other option but to do what I gotta do in order to actually win this match. Because losing isn't fun. So, you know, and obviously take into account, like, their teammates probably are actively farming their farming, you know what I'm saying? And it's not good.
One thing I would like to ask Survivor players, or rather Survivor players who predominantly only or mostly play Survivor, if you're at one gen left and you see a gen that's 95% done, and the killer is doing his best to put pressure on it, but he can only do so much because he's got no mobility and he's an M1 killer, say he's Trapper, are you gonna go start a new gen across the map? Or are you gonna make sure you get that gen done because it's faster and it's closer to being done and it just makes more sense? You're probably gonna go after the generator that's closest to being finished because it makes the most sense strategically. So why would you expect the killer to do anything different? Earlier in the video, I mentioned survivor-induced tunneling.
That's valid.
Where immersed survivors don't want to take aggro and force the killer to tunnel the only one they can find. You'll see a lot of survivors still expect the killer to waste valuable time searching for people who don't want to be found instead of chasing the only person they have a location on, and sometimes the people who were immersing will even go as far as insulting them for it when they make what is objectively the right play, which shows a huge lack of self-awareness. And again, as I said earlier, it's the old dark side Phil ideology where you blame everyone but yourself when it was completely preventable by you and you alone.
Thank you.
Now that I've gotten through all that, let's talk about anti-tunnel perks, specifically the issue with anti-tunnel perks, and more specifically decisive strike, off the record, borrowed time, and of course, shoulder the burden. I'll get this out of the way immediately. I have no issues with anti-tunnel perks existing, but let's also make it clear what anti-tunnel
He's got to toss in Dead Hard there too.
perks are actually for. Anti-tunnel perks aren't meant to stop tunneling. Anti-tunnel perks are meant to deter tunneling, and there is a stark difference between prevention and deterrence, and that's something we need to keep in mind. But you're probably sitting there and wondering, why bring up anti-tunnel perks? Well, to be honest, the truth is, and I know many killer players can relate to me here, when it comes to decisive strike and off the record specifically, most of the time, I'm hit with these perks when I'm not even tunneling. Survivors often use them as an offensive tactic rather than the intended purpose of not being tunneled. And a lot of the time,
I honestly see this more often than not. A good example is, say that you, for whatever reason, aren't going to go after that same survivor off the hook, and you're trying to go after the savior. The person with off the record is going to stand in the doorway to prevent you from even passing through, and to prevent you from chasing their teammate. So you are already kind of forced into having to hit off the endurance, and then because they're in front of your face, you're just gonna have to go for them anyway, right? Say for example, you're trying to once again go after somebody else, and they're gonna try to get in your way. You know what I'm saying? They'll try to jump into lockers in front of you to make sure that they can pull off the decisive, even though you're not going after that person. That's another thing that happens. Another example, I would say, those are the two key examples because those are the two most common anti-tunnel perks.
Survivors will be running both decisive strike and off the record, meaning they can just wave off the record in your face with absolutely no downside because they have decisive strike to bail them out as a second layer of protection.
100%
It's honestly quite boring.
Thank
I
you.
don't even want to get into how shoulder the burden's a thing, and it's a perk that was released that only seems to buff survive with friends instead of solo queue for some reason, which makes absolutely no sense to me. Listen, like I said, for the most part, I have no issue with anti-tunnel perks existing in their current form, and I have no issue with the base kit endurance you get for being unhooked. I think the only change I would make to these is to make it so if you have a currently active anti-tunnel perk or you have endurance, you no longer have collision with the killer or your teammates, which would mean you wouldn't be able to use your endurance to body block a teammate when the killer is actively trying to go after someone else. And before anyone wants to complain in the comments, if tunneling really is that big of a problem, if it's really happening that often, if that's really why you're running anti-tunnel perks, you should have absolutely no issue with not being able to use them offensively. And on top of that, if you really don't want to be tunneled, get away from the killer if he's trying to chase someone else. So
I agree with that idea. I heard about that with off the record before and stuff like that. I think that would be fair to some degree. I would say it would have to be balanced, obviously, but I would think that it does make sense that if it is supposed to be anti-tunnel and they're not going after you for whatever reason, you should not have to deal with, especially as a killer player, deal with like off the record, decisive, etc. offensively, because that's just not what it's intended purposes. But, you know, it's not a bad idea.
Having said all of that, what are some potential solutions to tunneling? Well, the truth is, there is no perfect solution. The fact is, tunneling, by design of the gameplay loop of DBD, is always going to exist, and it kind of always has to exist as an option. Generators go really fast for a lot of killers, especially those without map mobility to be able to apply pressure to them. And maps are insanely imbalanced a lot of the time and have an abundance of completely safe pallets, so even a mediocre survivor player can just waste a ton of the killer's time with little to no effort, and the killer's got to make up that time somehow. The best thing behavior can do is provide incentive for killers to not tunnel. They have to make it worth it spreading hooks and going after separate survivors. Similar to what I said in my slugging video. Incentive is everything, and behavior has, for all intents and purposes, been removing or nerfing things that incentivize going for separate survivors. I'll go ahead and give you a few examples. Barbecue and Chili had its blood point stacks removed. Grim Embrace was nerfed. Pain Resonance, heavily RNG based, also nerfed. Huntress Lullaby. Okay, decent perk, but it's a hex totem. You basically have to run a whole other perk just to extend the life of it long enough to get value from it. Oh wait, this isn't even based off separate survivors, just hooks in general, so that doesn't even count. The only perk I can really think of that's heavily incentivizing spreading hooks right now is No Way Out, which is admittedly something a lot of killers use. But other than that, there's nothing really incentivizing killers not to tunnel and turn the game into a 3v1 as quick as possible. Combine that with the amount of pressure killers have on them from the very beginning of the game and how long a single chase against even a mid-level survivor can be with the use of exhaustion perks and pre-dropping the abundance of safe pallets on most maps. I mean, what do we expect to happen?
Exactly. I'm glad he said. All of that was the most accurate. I couldn't have put it in a better way. That was exactly encapsulates the killer experience, especially as a like Ghostface main, like mainly M1s, like stuff like that. Oh my lord, like that is the main issue with playing the game with a lot of the maps, is that you kind of like are faced with like exhaustion perks that give a lot of free distance in combination with map size and the very, very safe tiles. So when you have all that in combination, you pretty much are not incentivized, or even more so, by you even not utilizing strategy, you are completely cooked. Like, you're just gonna lose every single game because you literally can't do anything else but to strategize around, especially with things like slugging and tunneling, in order to actually keep up with the other characters that are a bit stronger, like the S tiers. That's just a fact of life. Especially when you play a lot of killer and you go against a lot of strong teams and stuff like that. You're gonna face a lot of that, and you're going to have to, you know, do what you need to do, or you're just gonna lose all your games. He described it perfectly. That's literally the main problem. It doesn't require a lot of knowledge or skill to be able to do that, because the maps kind of lend itself to kind of play itself, you know. And I'm pretty sure you can think of any map, Garden of Joy, Area of Crows, Swamp, any variation of that. Very like you can just think of a few different maps off the top of your head, and it will probably have a lot of palette density and a lot of a very large maps with a lot of very strong palettes, and it's just very difficult to get pressure, especially with M1s. You could think of like Legion, Ghostface, arguably Freddy, Trapper, Pig. Like, it's insane. I think I mentioned Legion already, and then I think I can't remember another one off the top of my head, but maybe Hag too, stuff like that.
And even then, tunneling really isn't all that common. The only solution is to balance the gameplay loop around hooks so killers don't feel so damn pressured all the time. Of course, you'll always have that minority of toxic killer nerds who will just want to tunnel every game for sport, just like you have toxic survivor nerds who just want to bag at every pallet and make the killer miserable every single game. And there's not really a lot you can do about those people, but again, those are the minority. Even some of the most respected names in the community like Ottstarva and Hens have both said and shown that even at remotely mid to high level gameplay, it's unrealistic to expect killers to spread hooks. The game just isn't balanced that way in its current state, and that's a behavior problem, not a community problem. When it comes right down to it, tunneling isn't a black and white issue. There's a lot of nuances to it and a lot of misunderstandings from both sides when it comes to the cause and effect of tunneling. On top of that, much like slugging, tunneling doesn't just immediately translate to wins. There is a strategy to tunneling, and if you tunnel the wrong person or tunnel at the wrong time, you could be throwing the match. And I think that right there is why it's not really as common as people on places like DBD Twitter would like you to believe. In a perfect world, tunneling wouldn't exist and killers would never feel like it was necessary, which is a feeling that stems from how lopsided the balance in DBD is. And I'm not just talking about survivors versus killers when I say balance. I think this also applies to S-tier killers versus basically every other tier of killer. Sure, Nurse can handle anything you throw at her, but then you have to take into account that a killer like Trapper exists somehow in the same game as Nurse, which makes no sense. You might comfortably beat a team as Nurse, but in all likelihood you're going to be drowning in sweat against the very same team as Trapper. Of course, I'm using two extreme ends of the spectrum here, but you get the idea. There's no constant plane of difficulty that dictates if or when tunneling is a necessary tool to utilize. At the end of the day, as I said, it's up to behavior to balance the game in a way where spreading hooks is realistic, because right now it just isn't. Now, I know I'll have some random person in the comments that wants to say,
well, actually, I 4K every single game without perks or add-ons with Huntress, and I never tunnel or camp, so you just need to get good.
And that's when I would say, dude, shut up.
Thank you. Oh my god. I'm sure we've all heard somebody say this. We probably even knew somebody who said some nonsense like this. But what they fail to realize and what they fail to mention is that they only play Killer casually. Their amount of hours on Killer can range from maybe 2 to maybe 50 hours at most. You like maybe at the highest, I'm gonna be generous and say 30 hours. And like they're playing what, Killer every, I'm gonna say every couple of weeks or something, or once a day, maybe at most. They're not going against very tough teams, because they're going against, and this is how the MMR system sort of functions, you're going to, like, the more you win games and the more you play the side, they'll try to like put you against people around that same sort of win rate and stuff like that. They'll try to put you against stronger opponents the more you're winning, and they'll put you into brackets, you know, as well. So if you're not in a very high bracket, or at least in the mid to higher bracket, you're gonna struggle, because you know there's people that have all sorts of ranges of skill level. So by them saying that, they're already just not like, they're really just fully telling you like, hey, I don't play any Killer at all, or I play some Killer, but I'm not actively trying to win my games enough to hit those brackets in the first place. So it just goes to show that they don't really know that much about the side.
Stream it to Twitch, prove it. I will watch the whole thing and I will point and laugh when you can't do it. In any case, nerds, I hope you enjoyed this video as much as I enjoyed making it. I'm sorry it took me a little.
So with that being said, also, you know what I'm saying? Thank you all for watching the video up to this point. Leave a like, comment, and subscribe. Let me know what you guys think in the comment section. Go ahead and watch the original video by Pally, and it'll be linked in the description. And let me know what you guys think. Support the channel with the links in the description. Follow on Twitch for some live streams, and I'll see you guys in the next one.